So we learned that we can have an if statement, and then there is an optional else at the end of it. So the if statement will run if the condition is true. If you add an optional else to the end of it, the else will run whenever the if does not. I call it two buckets. One of the two will run. The if or the else will run. But notice the else doesn't have a condition on it. The else just says whenever the if doesn't run, the else will run. What if I wanted more than two buckets? What if I wanted another condition? This is where the if elif comes in. So here's our classic if, but now we can add another if called an elif, short for else if, that has a condition. So here's an example of what that might look like. If the current time is less than class start time, print you're too late for class. The elif has a condition on it because it has an if at the end. Current time is class start time, print you're right on time. So now I can have a second bucket, an elif bucket, that has a condition. But that brings us back to the statement that we can always have an optional else on the end. And this effectively would give me three buckets. I have the if, the condition is true, it executes it. Otherwise, it looks for an elif. If that condition is true, it will execute it. Otherwise, it will drop down to the else, which is always an optional value. So this is what it might look like. So if the semester is fall or spring, print, are you going to graduation? If the semester is summer, we have no graduation in the summer. Else, print, are you a student here? So using the if and the elif, which is short for else if, which does require a condition, I can now have multiple buckets. So let's give this a try. I know you had so much fun with the hummingbirds that we're going to do a little bit more with our hummingbirds. I am going to prompt for the name of your hummingbird, but in the last video I told you that Python is an incredibly flexible language, and I can surround my strings with single quotes or double quotes. So notice inside the input statement they are now single quotes. I'm going to try to write the rest of this program using single quotes, although my extensive Java background is probably going to throw me off just a little bit, so please bear with me. So now that I have your hummingbird's name, I'm going to prompt for your name, and then I am going to build a traditional if statement that if your name is the same as your bird's name, it's not very original, else we're going to say that that's a great name for hummingbird. I'm actually going to put some new lines at the end of these print statements to try to separate all of the runs of the program or the output statements over here in our output. I'm also going to add a blank line between the if and the else, because we'd like it to be a little bit more readable. So let's run it and see what it says. So I'm going to say the bird's name is Speedy and my name is also Speedy, and it's going to print in the output. That's not very original. So I'm going to put a space for readability between the if and the else, and then let's see if we can practice the if elif. All right, so on line 16, I'm going to prompt the user for the number of nests that Speedy has built this season, and I'm going to see if a format of the F will work in front of the single quotes. So let's run it and see if it works. I'll say my bird's name is Speedy and my name is George. How many nests has Speedy built this season? And then I'll give an answer to 12. So our F format works with single quotes or double quotes. Now let's add an if elif to this. All right, so line 18, I'm going to add an if statement that if they have no nest, that they haven't started nesting yet, and then I am going to add an elif. So the elif requires a condition. So this would say if nest is equal to 1, we're going to print Speedy has built a nest and maybe raising chicks. So we can have an if elif, But as always, we can have the optional else at the end. Let's just test this without the optional else. So the name, we'll say the bird's name is Speedy and my name is Gonzalez. How many nests has Speedy built this season? I'm going to say either 1 or 0. If I put 1, it will run the if on 18. If I say 0, it runs the if on line 18. If I say 1, it should run the elif. Let's put the 1 in there and see if we can get the elif to run. So if I press enter, it says Speedy has built a nest and may be raising chicks. So it did run the elif. I can add a condition to the if statement. So I kind of like the way my output is separating these print statements. And so I'm going to put a couple of backslash n's inside of these print statements so that when I run it, Speedy and George, how many nests has Speedy built? What happens if I don't put a 1 or a 0? What happens if I put something else? What would you expect to run off of that print statement? And it's not going to run anything at all because both the if and the elif have a condition, which is the reason why we might want to use a default else. So to test out an if, elif, else, I'm going to prompt for the number of feeders that Speedy is defending. I'm going to cast that to an int and put it into an integer variable so I can then compare it to integer values. My if statement is for feeders exactly 0. My elif has a condition on it. Feeders less than or equal to 2. What do you think would happen if they put in feeders that were negative, like a -4? Let's run it and see what happens. So I'll put 1, 2. Those are terrible names. So now I have a bird whose name is 1. How many nests? If I put in anything but 0 or 1, lines 18 and 21, it doesn't do anything. So I'll put in 1 so we can get the elif, and I can see my print statement on my elif. And this is prompting for the feeders on line 26. So how many feeders is my bird defending? I am going to put a -2. What would you expect to have happen if I said a -2? Well, the if is running for feeders exactly equal to 0. My elif is running for feeders that are less than or equal to 2. A -2 is most definitely less than or equal to 2. So it should print the elif print statement. But this was, what happens if they key in anything else? So let's see, I'll tab this down. And let's add an else to this. And I am, again, as I mentioned before, I am trying to make this a little bit more readable. Let me tab this down a little bit. My cursor is going to say tabbed in. And so I am putting a little bit of space between each one of these clauses in the if, elif, else statement to make it a little bit more readable. I would ask you, do you prefer to have the blank statement there, or do you like having them snug right up next to each other? Python is good with either one of these presentations. It kind of ignores, for the most part, ignores white space. It's up to you to decide which one for you is more readable. So now let's test our if, elif, else. So we should probably have a good name for our hummingbird. George. My name could be Sammy. Oops, you spelled it right. My name will be Sammy. How many nests? I'm going to say 2 nests, which is going to skip the entire if, elif on line 18 and 21. Here is feeders. So now, if we say 0, it's the if. If I put anything less than 2, it would say elif, and then anything else is going to drop into the else. So if I said 15, if it skips the if and if it skips the elif, it will run the else. So let's see if the else runs from line 33. So if I can have 1 elif, line 30 is, and line 21, as a matter of fact, both of those are a single elif. do you think it's possible to have more than one elif? So on line 37, we're going to see if we can get if elif, elif else, if we can do two elifs. So I'm going to prompt for how fast your heart beats. And then I'm going to add an if. Your heart is beating between 20 and 60. You must be doing yoga. So I have my if statement here. I'm now going to add an elif because now we want to check your heart rate between 60 and 100. And under those conditions, you're probably watching TV. So now let's see if we can add another elif for heart rates that are over 100. Actually, we're going to try 100 or over. Remember, we were talking about boundary values. So this is going to be greater than or equal to 100, greater than or equal to 60, less than 100. You need to pay attention to those boundary values because which one of these three buckets, the first elif or the second elif, which one would 100 drop into? And that's why it's important to have test cases so that you know where your boundary values are going. So now I have an if heart rate between 20 and 60, elif between 60 and 100, elif, it is over 100. So over 100, your heartbeat, so you must be doing yoga, you're watching TV, you're still not as fast as Speedy. I'm going to add a couple of more print statements here because Speedy is very, very impressive. His heart beats at 1,200 beats per minute, and he takes approximately 250 breaths. You've got to be impressed with your hummingbird, right? But because my comment on line 30 says we should probably have a default else, I am going to add an else to the bottom of this because it would seem to me the only other category, if we've gone from 20 to 60 to 100 and over, is probably less than 20. So it seems like anything less than 20, actually 20 is a boundary value, so anything 20 or less would drop into iZombie. So let's run it and just test this one a little bit. So I'll call my bird Sammy. We'll put 2. How many feeders? So the else, we have the else on line 32 for the feeders. So if I say 5, he's guarding a bunch of feeders. Now here is the heartbeat. How fast is my heartbeat? So I want to test the if, the elif, and the second elif, and then the else. Let's see if we can test the first elif for a heart rate between 60 and 100. I'm going to put 75. That should give me the elif on line 43 and tell me that I am watching TV. And I forgot to force my new lines, so now my print statements are back to back. Now I know this video is running a little bit long, so I'm going to stop it here. I'm going to create one final video because I would like to know if we can nest if statements. Could I put an if inside of an if or an elif? So I'm going to create another video for that. I'll just tack it on to the bottom of this code here since it's going to be using your